medieval knighthood never really ended either. Like so much of the ancient and medieval world, it settled into ordinary language, tucked into words people use every day without ever picturing a man in armor at all. Take chivalry. The word comes from the old French chivalry, itself built from cheval, meaning horse, since a knight was, at the most basic level, defined by his ability to fight on horseback. The connection survives in cavalier as well, a word that once simply meant a mounted soldier, and only later drifted toward its modern sense of someone acting with careless disregard, a shift historians trace to the word's association with dashing, sometimes reckless noblemen during the English Civil War. Martial began as a lowly job. In its earliest form, the word described someone who tended horses in a stable, from the old High German Mara, horse, and Skalk, servant. Over the centuries, the title climbed steadily upward through military and royal households, until a marshal became one of the highest-ranking officers in a kingdom, a rise in status that has nothing to do with the word's original, humble meaning. Constable followed a similar path. It comes from the Latin, comes stabuli, meaning the count of the stable. Another title that began with horses and ended, centuries later, attached to police officers who have never touched a warhorse in their lives. Esquire, and its shortened form squire, comes from the Old French escuyer, ultimately from the Latin scutarius, meaning shield-bearer. A squire's original job was carrying and caring for a knight's shield and armor, a role that could last for years before a young man earned knighthood of his own. Even the word knight carries a surprising twist. In Old English, sign simply meant boy or servant, with no connection to horses, armor, or nobility at all. Only gradually, as mounted warriors gained social prestige across the early medieval centuries, did the word shift to describe an armed retainer of high standing, eventually settling into the meaning familiar today. Melee, still used for any chaotic close combat, comes directly from the Old French mesli, a mingling or mixing together, an apt description for the confused, disorganized brawl. A tournament could become once dozens of armored riders collided at once. Havoc carries its own military history. To cry havoc was originally a specific command given on a medieval battlefield, a formal signal permitting soldiers to break ranks and begin plundering. A practice serious enough that English law eventually made crying havoc without proper authority a punishable offense. And checkmate, a word most people encounter only across a chessboard, actually comes from the Persian shamat, meaning the king is helpless, passed into Arabic and then into medieval European languages as the game of chess itself traveled west, carrying with it a small piece of the very battlefield vocabulary this account is about to explore in full. Knighthood, as history remembers it, could not have existed without one small piece of equipment, the stirrup. Before its widespread adoption in Europe, roughly in the 8th century, a rider swinging a heavy weapon from horseback risked simply falling off with the force of his own swing. The stirrup gave a mounted warrior a stable platform to brace against, allowing him to deliver a blow or absorb the shock of a lance strike without losing his seat. Some historians have argued that this single piece of technology helped reshape European society itself, since maintaining an armored horseman required land, income, and leisure time for training. encouraging the rise of a land-holding warrior class that would eventually become medieval knighthood. Charlemagne's Frankish kingdom, spanning much of Western Europe by the early 9th century, relied increasingly on mounted warriors supported by land grants in exchange for military service, an early version of the feudal arrangement that would define knighthood for centuries afterward. A vassal received land, called a fief, from a lord, and in exchange owed military service, typically a set number of days each year, along with loyalty and various other obligations. This exchange, land for service, sat at the center of the entire feudal system, and a knight's fief was often described simply as his knight's fee, the very foundation of his ability to afford a warhorse, armor, and weapons in the first place. By the time the term knight had settled into its familiar meaning, sometime around the 11th century, it described a mounted, armored warrior bound to a lord through this same web of land and obligation, a status that combined military function with steadily rising social prestige. The Bayeux Tapestry, a nearly 70-meter embroidered account of the Norman conquest of England, completed within a few decades of the 166 Battle of Hastings, offers one of the earliest and most detailed visual records of this new style of warfare, showing mounted Norman warriors with couched lances, held braced under the arm rather than thrown or swung overhead, a technique made possible in part by the stability the stirrup provided. Becoming a knight was rarely quick and almost never cheap. Training typically began around age 7, when a boy from a noble or landholding family was sent to live in another lord's household as a page, learning basic manners, horsemanship, and the beginnings of combat skills, often alongside a genuine education in music, dancing, and courtly behavior expected of the aristocracy. Around age 14, a page who showed promise moved up to the role of squire, attaching himself to a specific knight as an attendant and apprentice. A squire's duties covered a wide range, caring for his knight's horses and weapons, helping him dress in armor, a task that could take the better part of an hour with a full plate harness, and accompanying him into battle to assist however needed, sometimes even fighting alongside him once trusted enough. Squires spent years absorbing both the practical skills of combat and the social and moral expectations attached to knighthood before their own training was considered complete. Knighthood itself was granted through a ceremony called the accolade, which could range from a simple, informal tap on the shoulder given on a battlefield immediately after a display of courage, to an elaborate, carefully staged religious ceremony held in a great hall or cathedral. In its fuller form, the ceremony was often preceded by a ritual bath, symbolizing spiritual purification, and a night spent in prayer and quiet reflection inside a chapel known as the Vigil of Arms, during which the candidate's sword and armor rested on the altar overnight while he kept watch alone. A solemn preparation meant to mark the seriousness of the commitment he was about to take on. The following morning, after confession and mass, the candidate would be formally dubbed, traditionally struck lightly on the shoulder or neck with the flat of a sword, and rise as a knight. The expense involved in reaching this point should not be underestimated. A full set of quality armor, a strong warhorse or several, additional horses for travel and baggage, and the weapons and equipment expected of a knight together represented a genuine fortune, roughly comparable, by some modern estimates, to the cost of a small house. Many young men from lesser noble families never completed the journey to knighthood simply because they or their families could not afford the equipment it required, remaining squires for their entire adult lives despite having the training and skill of any knighted peer. England developed its own distinctive legal wrinkle connecting knighthood directly to taxation and property law, a practice known as distraint of knighthood. Under this system, any man who held land above a certain value was legally required either to formally accept knighthood with all the expensive equipment and obligations that came with it, or to pay a fine to the crown in lieu of taking up the honor. Rather than knighthood functioning purely as a voluntary mark of achievement, English monarchs used distraint of knighthood as a practical revenue-raising tool at various points across the medieval period, meaning that plenty of wealthy landholders became knights or paid to avoid becoming one, not out of any particular martial ambition, but simply because the law required a choice between the two. Not every path to knighthood ran through inherited land and a family fortune large enough to cover that expense. Battlefield valor offered a genuine, if uncommon, route upward for men without noble birth, since a commander or king could grant knighthood on the spot to a soldier who had distinguished himself through exceptional courage or skill in combat, bypassing the usual years of training as page and squire entirely. Royal favor could achieve a similar result, away from the battlefield, with kings occasionally elevating skilled administrators, loyal servants, or simply men they wished to reward directly to knighthood as a mark of royal gratitude, showing that for all its emphasis on inherited lineage and formal training, medieval knighthood retained at least some genuine paths for a determined or fortunate man to rise beyond the circumstances of his birth. Armor evolved steadily across the medieval centuries, and its development says a great deal about how warfare itself was changing over time. Early medieval warriors relied heavily on mail. Thousands of small interlocking iron rings riveted individually by hand, a process that could take a skilled craftsman many months to complete a single full shirt of mail, known as a hauberk. Mail offered real protection against cutting blows and provided some defense against thrusts, though it did little to absorb the blunt force of a heavy strike, which is why it was almost always worn over a padded garment called a gambeson, a quilted layer that cushioned impacts and made the whole combination far more effective than either piece alone. Plate armor developed gradually through the 14th and 15th centuries, first as individual reinforcing pieces added over mail, then eventually as complete, fitted suits covering the entire body in shaped steel plates. Full plate armor represents one of the more persistently misunderstood pieces of medieval material culture. Popular imagination often pictures knights as barely able to move under hundreds of pounds of metal, sometimes needing a crane to be hoisted onto their horses. Surviving suits of armor and modern reconstructions tell a different story. A complete harness of well-fitted plate typically weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds, distributed carefully across the entire body rather than concentrated on the shoulders, a weight roughly comparable to a modern soldier's full combat kit. Historical reenactors and museum demonstrations have shown knights in accurate reproduction armor, running, climbing ladders, and vaulting onto horseback unassisted, confirming that well-made plate armor, while certainly demanding, allowed far more mobility than the popular image suggests. The best armor was custom fitted to its owner, shaped and adjusted by skilled armorers to move naturally with the body's joints, and the finest suits, produced by renowned workshops in cities like Milan, Augsburg, and Nuremberg, commanded prices that placed them firmly among the most expensive personal possessions a nobleman could own. Decorated in some cases with elaborate etching, fluting, or gilding that turned functional battle gear into a genuine display of wealth and status. A separate category of armor, built heavier and more specialized, was designed specifically for tournament jousting rather than the battlefield, sometimes bolted or strapped to the wearer's own harness for maximum protection against a lance strike delivered at close range and high speed. Equipment too cumbersome for the flexibility. Real combat demanded, but ideally suited to surviving a single, violent collision on a tilt. Helmets changed shape dramatically across the medieval centuries, and each shift reflects a running conversation between offense and defense that shaped nearly every piece of a knight's equipment. Early Norman knights favored a simple conical helmet with a nasal bar, a narrow strip of metal extending down to protect the nose while leaving most of the face exposed, offering real protection with minimal restriction on vision or breathing. By the 13th century, the great helm had emerged, a large cylindrical or slightly tapered helmet enclosing the entire head, offering far better protection, but at a real cost: limited visibility, poor ventilation, and enough weight and awkwardness that knights typically wore it only in the moments immediately before and during a charge, often removing it between engagements to rest and see more clearly. The 14th century brought the bassinet, a lighter, more form-fitting helmet that could be worn for extended periods, frequently paired with a separate visor that could be raised for visibility and lowered for protection as circumstances demanded. A particular style of bassinet, featuring a pointed, protruding visor, nicknamed the houndskull for its resemblance to a dog's snout, became especially associated with the later 14th century, its distinctive shape helping deflect glancing blows away from the face rather than absorbing them directly. By the 15th century, the armor had developed as a more sophisticated design, hinged to open around the sides of the head like a shell rather than simply lifting a visor, offering full coverage with a closer, more comfortable fit than earlier styles had generally managed. Vision remained a persistent challenge throughout every stage of this development. Narrow eye slits and small ventilation holes, positioned carefully to avoid creating weak points an enemy blade or arrow might find, meant that a knight fighting with his visor down typically had significantly reduced peripheral vision and could struggle to hear clearly over the sound of his own breathing echoing inside the enclosed helmet. A real tactical vulnerability that fighters learn to manage through training, situational awareness, and, when possible, trusted companions watching their flanks during the confusion of close combat. A full suit of plate armor could never simply be strapped directly onto bare skin. An arming doublet, a heavily padded and reinforced garment fitted closely to the body, provided cushioning against the hard edges of plate, distributed the armor's weight more evenly across the wearer, and included points, small laces or ties, at key locations, allowing individual armor pieces to be securely fastened to the garment underneath, rather than relying on the plates alone to stay properly positioned during violent movement. Beneath this doublet, a knight typically wore a simple linen shirt and hose, practical, breathable layers that helped manage the very real problem of heat and sweat building up inside an enclosed metal shell, above all during a long day of fighting or a hot summer campaign. Gloves, called gauntlets in their armored form, deserve special mention for the genuine skill required to make them properly, since a well-articulated gauntlet needed to protect the entire hand while still allowing enough dexterity to grip a sword, adjust a horse's reins, or manage the small buckles and straps involved in a knight's own equipment. a balance between protection and fine motor control that separated a truly skilled armorer's work from a merely adequate one. The knightly sword occupies an outsized place in popular imagination. And here too, the popular image drifts from the evidence. Medieval arming swords, the single-handed weapons most associated with knights through much of the period, typically weighed between 2 and 3.5 pounds, a figure confirmed repeatedly by surviving originals held in museum collections around the world. Longer two-handed swords, which became more common from the 14th century onward as armor improved and fighters needed greater leverage, still rarely exceeded 5 or 6 pounds. The image of knights swinging blades so heavy that only brute strength could lift them belongs almost entirely to film and fantasy rather than surviving history, since a well-balanced sword in that weight range could be handled with considerable speed and precision by a trained fighter. Swords carried symbolic weight as heavy as their steel. The cross formed by blade and guard connected the weapon naturally to Christian symbolism, and knights sometimes swore oaths upon their sword hilts as though upon a cross. Individual swords in legend and literature were often given personal names, a tradition reflected in real medieval culture as well. Charlemagne's sword was remembered as Joyeuse, and King Arthur's Excalibur remains the most famous example of a weapon treated less as a tool and more as a character in its own right, imbued with history, loyalty, and sometimes magical significance. Beyond the sword, a knight's arsenal grew wider as armor grew more effective at stopping cuts and thrusts. The lance, a long wooden shaft tipped with steel, remained the primary weapon of a mounted charge, its force multiplied by the combined weight and speed of horse and rider driving forward together. Once combatants closed to grappling range, or once a lance broke on impact, knights turned to secondary weapons suited to defeating armor rather than skin, maces and warhammers, which delivered crushing, blunt trauma capable of breaking bone even through steel plate, and the poleaxe, a versatile pole weapon combining an axe blade, a hammerhead, and a spike, popular among dismounted knights fighting in close, brutal engagements where a sword's edge alone struggled to find purchase against a well-armored opponent. A smaller blade called the miséricorde, French for mercy, was carried specifically to slip through the narrow gaps in an opponent's armor, at the joints or visor, delivering a final, decisive strike. Once a fight had already been effectively settled, a grim but practical piece of a knight's standard equipment. Armor and offensive weapons developed in a continuous, escalating conversation with each other, each advance in protection prompting a corresponding advance in whatever could defeat it. The crossbow occupies an especially interesting place in this ongoing arms race, since its mechanical draw allowed even a relatively untrained soldier to loose a bolt with enough force to threaten mail, and under the right conditions of range and angle, the weaker points of plate armor as well. A leveling of the traditional advantage held by highly trained knightly combatants that some contemporary authorities found deeply troubling. The Second Lateran Council, a major church gathering held in 1139, went so far as to formally condemn the crossbow as a weapon too lethal and too indiscriminate for use between Christians, permitting it only against non-Christian enemies, a prohibition that, like so many medieval church rulings on the conduct of war, was widely ignored in practice as the weapon's battlefield effectiveness made it too useful for commanders to set aside. The English longbow demanded a different kind of investment than the crossbow, requiring years of sustained practice to build the physical strength needed to draw a warbow effectively. A demand reflected in English laws requiring regular archery practice among the general population and in skeletal evidence from English archer burials showing distinctive bone development in the shoulders and arms consistent with a lifetime of repeated heavy draws. Armourers responded to both weapons by refining plate armor's shape, angling surfaces to deflect rather than absorb a direct hit, and reinforcing especially vulnerable areas, a defensive adaptation that, in turn, pushed weapon makers to develop specialized armor-piercing arrowheads and thrusting swords narrow enough to slip through the gaps that even the best-fitted plate could never fully eliminate. As armor grew more effective at turning aside a standard blade's cutting edge, sword makers responded with an increasingly specialized weapon, the estoc, a stiff, narrow blade with little or no cutting edge at all, designed purely for thrusting into the gaps and joints. A well-articulated suit of plate could never fully seal. Wielded two-handed and thrust with the fighter's full body weight behind the point, an estoc could find its way through a visor's eye slit, the joint at an armpit or elbow, or the narrow seam where one plate overlapped another. As heavily armored cavalry began giving ground to disciplined infantry formations, one further weapon belongs to this story, even though it sits right at the edge of the medieval period, spilling over into the early 16th century, the two-handed greatsword, sometimes called a Zweihänder in German-speaking territories, a massive blade associated with specialized infantry trained to break into the dense ranks of pike formations. These sword-wielding specialists, according to some accounts paid above the standard soldier's wage in recognition of the danger their role demanded, represent a late evolution of individual swordsmanship, adapting to a battlefield increasingly dominated by massed infantry rather than the mounted, individual combat that had defined knighthood for so much of the medieval period. This back and forth between offense and defense never fully resolved in favor of either side. Before gunpowder changed the terms of the contest entirely, and it offers one of the clearest illustrations of how medieval military technology actually evolved, not through any single decisive breakthrough, but through centuries of incremental adjustment, each side responding to the other's innovations in a slow, continuous cycle that shaped everything from the shape of a helmet's visor to the precise taper of an arrowhead. A knight was defined as much by his horse as by his armor, and medieval Europe recognized several distinct types of horses bred and trained for different purposes. The destrier, the most prized and expensive of all, was the classic warhorse, bred for strength, courage under pressure, and the ability to carry an armored rider into a charge without bolting at the noise and chaos of battle. Destriers were relatively rare and correspondingly costly, often worth more than several ordinary horses combined, and a knight typically owned more than one, reserving his finest destrier for battle or tournament while traveling on a less valuable animal to preserve his best mount strength. The courser, lighter and faster than the destrier, served well for general riding and some combat roles, while the palfrey, prized for its smooth gait, functioned as a comfortable traveling horse, often ridden by both knights and noblewomen for everyday journeys rather than warfare. Pack horses and sumpter horses, meanwhile, carried the substantial baggage a knight's household required on campaign, including his armor, tents, and supplies, meaning that a single knight traveling to war might realistically be accompanied by several horses and at least one squire simply to manage them all. horses intended for battle underwent their own training, learning to remain calm amid noise, to charge on command, and in some cases to kick or bite at an enemy during close combat. The finest warhorses were themselves protected by barding, armour fitted to cover the horse's head, neck and body, ranging from padded cloth and leather to, by the 15th century, full plate coverings for the most valuable animals belonging to the wealthiest lords. A horse represented such a significant investment that losing one in battle could be a genuine financial disaster. And medieval armies sometimes included specific provisions or compensation schemes for knights whose mounts were killed in royal service, recognizing that an unhorsed knight, however skilled, was far less effective and far more vulnerable than one still mounted. Long before a squire ever faced an opponent in earnest, his days were filled with repetitive, physically demanding training exercises designed to build the specific strength and coordination knighthood required. The quintain, a simple but effective device consisting of a pivoting arm mounted on a post with a shield or padded target on one end and a sandbag or weighted sack on the other, taught a young rider the timing needed for a lance strike. A poorly aimed or poorly timed blow against the target would cause the arm to swing rapidly around, and the trailing weight could knock an unprepared rider clean off his horse, providing an immediate physical lesson in the consequences of a sloppy technique that no amount of verbal correction could match. The pell, a sturdy wooden post set upright in the ground, served a similar function for sword work, allowing a trainee to practice cuts, thrusts, and footwork against a stationary target, sturdy enough to absorb repeated full-force strikes without breaking. Building both the raw strength and the precise control needed to land an effective blow in real combat. Wrestling formed another core part of a squire's education, since grappling skills proved essential once. Two armoured combatants closed to very close range, where a sword's cutting edge often struggled to find any real opening in an opponent's plate armour, and the fight instead turned toward throws, holds, and attempts to force an opponent to the ground, where a dagger could finish the contest through a gap in the armour. Archery, though not typically a knight's primary weapon on the battlefield, still featured in many young noblemen's broader education, alongside swimming, running, and various other athletic pursuits meant to build the general fitness and endurance a long day of fighting in armour demanded. Squires also spent considerable time simply caring for equipment, cleaning and oiling armour to prevent rust, mending and adjusting the leather straps holding a harness together, and maintaining a knight's horses, tasks that might seem menial but that taught a deep, practical familiarity with the tools of the trade a squire would eventually depend on to survive his own battles. Hunting occupied a central place in knightly leisure, valued both as practical training for warfare, sharpening skills in horsemanship, tracking, and weapon use, and as an important social ritual in its own right. Falconry in particular carried real prestige, and medieval society developed an elaborate, semi-formal hierarchy dictating which species of hawk or falcon was appropriate to a person's specific rank, with the most powerful birds reserved, at least in principle, for kings and the highest nobility, a system recorded in period texts like the Book of St. Albans. It occupied, in truth, far more of a knight's actual time than warfare itself for most men who held the title. And the chase followed elaborate, almost ceremonial conventions of its own, with specific horn calls developed to communicate different stages of a hunt across considerable distances in dense forest, where riders and hounds might easily lose sight of one another. A skilled huntsman could signal the discovery of prey, the direction of pursuit, or the moment of a kill through a recognized vocabulary of horn blasts. A practical communication system built on the same basic principle that served on a battlefield. Simple, standardized sound patterns capable of carrying information across noisy, chaotic, visually obstructed conditions. Boar hunting carried particular danger and particular prestige, since a cornered wild boar could turn on hunters and horses alike with real, sometimes lethal force, making a successful boar hunt a genuine test of nerve as well as skill. One reason the pursuit remained popular among a class of men whose social identity rested so heavily on demonstrated courage. Deer hunting, by contrast, offered a more controlled, ceremonial form of the sport, often concluding with a formal ritual butchering of the kill called the unmaking, performed according to precise customary steps, and sometimes serving as its own occasion for teaching younger nobles proper technique and etiquette. The code of chivalry, as medieval writers described it, called for courage, loyalty, generosity, courtesy, and protection of the weak. Ideals promoted heavily through literature, sermons, and the romances that circulated among the nobility. In practice, this code applied selectively. Chivalric courtesy and mercy were generally reserved for fellow knights and nobles, above all opponents of similar rank, who might be captured and ransomed rather than killed, since a living prisoner of good family was worth a considerable sum in ransom payments, while a dead one was worth nothing at all. Commoners caught up in medieval warfare, whether as foot soldiers or simply as residents of a besieged town, rarely received the same consideration, and campaigns against peasant populations could involve real brutality that sits uneasily alongside chivalry's more polished literary image. Courtly love, a closely related ideal celebrated by troubadours and romance writers across France and beyond, imagined a knight devoted to an idealized, often unattainable noblewoman, performing brave deeds in her honor and treasuring some small token, a scarf, a ribbon, a glove, as a symbol of her favor. Whether this literary convention reflected genuine widespread practice or remained largely confined to poetry and songs composed for aristocratic entertainment remains a subject of real debate among historians, though the imagery proved durable enough to shape romantic storytelling for centuries afterward. Medieval writers sometimes organized chivalric virtue around a symbolic list known as the Nine Worthies, 9 legendary and historical figures held up as models of martial and moral excellence, drawn in equal measure from pagan antiquity, the Hebrew Bible, and Christian history. Figures like Hector of Troy, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar standing alongside King David and Judas Maccabeus, alongside King Arthur, Charlemagne, and the Crusader Godfrey of Bouillon. The grouping reveals something about how medieval Europe understood its own place in a much longer story of heroism, stretching back through classical and biblical history, positioning contemporary knighthood as the latest chapter in a tradition believed to run continuously from the ancient world to the medieval present. Faith ran through nearly every aspect of a knight's identity, and the Church actively worked, with mixed success, to shape how and when knightly violence could be directed. Beginning in the late 10th century, church councils across France promoted a movement known as the Peace of God, which sought to place certain categories of people, clergy, peasants, and merchants among them, off limits from the violence of feudal warfare, followed shortly afterward by the related Truce of God movement. which attempted to restrict fighting to specific days of the week, leaving Sundays and various holy periods free from combat. Neither movement achieved anything close to full compliance, but together they represent a genuine, sustained effort by medieval religious authorities to place moral limits on a warrior class. The Church could not simply disarm outright. St. George became the most widely recognized patron figure associated with knighthood across much of medieval Europe. His legendary battle against a dragon serving as a popular symbol of righteous struggle against evil. Even though the story itself developed centuries after any historical figure the legend might be based on could plausibly have lived. St. George's Cross became closely associated with English identity in particular, and the broader cult of knightly patron saints extended to other figures as well, including St. Michael the Archangel, frequently invoked as a heavenly warrior and protector for knights heading into battle. Pilgrimage carried real weight within a knight's religious life, offering a way to seek forgiveness for sins, including the violence inherent in a knight's own profession, through visits to significant holy sites, whether nearby local shrines or, for those with sufficient means, the more demanding journeys to Rome, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or Jerusalem itself. Participation in a crusade carried an especially strong religious incentive, since the Church offered spiritual indulgences, a formal reduction of the punishment believers otherwise expected to face for their sins, to those who took up the cross, blending martial service directly with the promise of genuine spiritual benefit in a way that helps explain why crusading appealed so strongly to a class of men whose everyday profession otherwise sat uneasily alongside Christian teaching on violence and mercy. The ideals of chivalry did receive at least one serious attempt at formal written codification during the medieval period itself. Ramon Rullal, a Mallorcan writer and philosopher active in the 13th century, composed the Book of the Order of Chivalry, a treatise laying out the duties, virtues, and proper conduct expected of a knight in considerable detail, covering everything from the symbolic meaning of individual pieces of armor and equipment to the specific moral obligations a knight owed to his faith, his lord, and the weaker members of society he was meant to protect. Lull's work became influential across medieval Europe, translated into multiple languages, and later printed in English by William Caxton in the 15th century, offering one of the clearest surviving windows into how chivalry was formally taught and understood by at least some segments of medieval society, rather than simply lived out informally through custom and example. A later, frequently cited list known as the 10 Commandments of Chivalry, often quoted today as though it were a direct medieval text, actually comes from the work of a 19th century French historian, Léon Gaultier, who compiled and synthesized his own summary of chivalric ideals drawn from a wide range of medieval sources into a single, tightly numbered list. While Gaultier's list captures real themes present in genuine medieval writing, faith, loyalty, generosity, protection of the weak, it represents a Victorian-era historian's organized interpretation of chivalry rather than a document any medieval knight himself would have recognized or recited, a distinction worth keeping in mind given how often the list circulates today as though it were an authentic piece of medieval writing. Surrender itself followed its own recognized customs within the world of knightly warfare, a set of practical conventions that shaped how a defeated fighter could expect to be treated depending on his status and circumstances. A knight who found himself overwhelmed in single combat or unhorsed and surrounded with no realistic chance of escape, could formally yield to his opponent, often by offering some symbolic gesture, handing over a sword or a gauntlet, or simply speaking the words of surrender aloud, an act that shifted him instantly from combatant to prisoner, and under the customs most knights recognized, entitled him to reasonably humane treatment rather than summary execution. This convention rested heavily on a simple economic reality. A captor stood to gain far more from a living, ransomable prisoner than from a dead opponent, aligning financial self-interest neatly with the more idealized chivalric language of mercy toward a defeated foe. These customs, however, applied unevenly, and their limits reveal a good deal about how selectively chivalric mercy actually functioned in practice. Common soldiers and foot troops, lacking the wealth or noble connections that made a captured knight valuable, received no such reliable protection. And medieval chronicles record numerous instances where a battle's aftermath saw ordinary prisoners killed outright, while captured knights of similar or even lesser military importance were carefully preserved for ransom. Some infamous episodes saw even this selective mercy abandoned entirely under pressure of battlefield necessity, as when English forces at Agincourt, fearing a renewed French attack while managing an unusually large number of prisoners with insufficient guards to control them safely, ordered a significant number of captives killed, an order that troubled some chroniclers writing about the battle even at the time, and that stands as an uncomfortable reminder of how quickly chivalric convention could give way. Once a commander judged military necessity demanded it. Tournaments began as practical training exercises and gradually developed into elaborate social spectacles in their own right. Early tournaments, common from the 12th century onward, often centered on the melee, a large-scale mock battle fought between two teams of knights across open countryside, sometimes covering several square miles and lasting the better part of a day. These early melees were truly dangerous, closely resembling real warfare, and serious injuries or deaths were far from unusual, since the weapons used, while sometimes blunted, still carried enough force to cause real harm at speed. William Marshall, an English knight born to a lesser noble family in the 12th century, built an unusual career and a personal fortune almost entirely through tournament success, a rise that would eventually carry him to the very top of English political life. Marshall's own biography, an unusually detailed account for the period, records him capturing over 500 opponents across his tournament career, each capture worth a ransom in the form of the defeated knight's horse, armor, or an agreed payment, turning tournament competition into a genuine and lucrative profession for a skilled fighter without significant inherited wealth of his own. Jousting, the one-on-one contest most associated with tournaments today, involved two mounted knights charging toward each other along a course, aiming a lance to strike an opponent's shield or armor while remaining seated. The tilt, a wooden barrier running down the center of the course to keep the two horses from colliding head-on, was a later refinement, not appearing widely until the 15th century, meaning earlier jousts carried the added danger of a direct horse collision alongside the lance strike itself. By the later medieval period, lances used in more formal tournament jousting were often built or scored to break more easily than a battlefield lance, a feature that reduced the force delivered to the opponent while still producing a dramatic, visually satisfying break, and specialized jousting armor, heavier and more rigid than battlefield gear. offered additional protection suited to absorbing a single powerful, predictable impact rather than the varied demands of open combat. Tournaments were rarely without real risk, even in their more regulated later forms. King Henry II of France died in 1559 after a splintered lance pierced his eye during a jousting match celebrating his daughter's wedding, a death serious enough that it contributed to a broader decline in enthusiasm for full contact jousting among European nobility over the following decades. Prizes, ladies' favours worn on a knight's lance or helm, and the social prestige of victory all combined to keep tournaments a central feature of aristocratic life for several centuries, blending genuine athletic competition with courtly display, political theatre, and, for skilled competitors like William Marshall, a viable path to wealth and influence. Beyond the standard melee and joust, medieval tournament culture developed more specialized and theatrical forms of contest as the centuries progressed. The port d'armes, meaning passage of arms, involved a knight or small group of knights declaring their intention to defend a specific location, often a bridge, a gate, or some other symbolic passage, against any challenger willing to test them, sometimes maintaining this defense for days or weeks at a stretch as traveling knights arrived to accept the challenge one after another. These events blended genuine athletic competition with elaborate theatrical staging, complete with symbolic themes, costumes, and scripted challenges, transforming what had begun as straightforward combat training into something closer to interactive medieval theatre performed for an audience of nobility. A major tournament could reshape a town's fortunes for weeks at a stretch. Knights arriving for a large tournament brought retinues of squires, servants, and additional horses that all needed food, lodging, and stabling. And a host town's innkeepers, brewers, and stable owners could see a genuine surge in business during the days surrounding a major event. Armourers and blacksmiths found steady work as well, repairing damaged equipment and replacing broken lance tips between rounds, while merchants selling cloth, wine, and luxury goods set up temporary stalls to capture the spending of nobility gathered with money to display and prizes to compete for. Local lords sometimes actively competed to host tournaments, specifically for the prestige and revenue involved. And towns fortunate enough to become regular tournament venues could build a genuine local identity and ongoing income around the events. Much as certain cities became associated with particular fairs or markets elsewhere in medieval Europe. Entry fees, fines for rule violations, and a share of ransoms paid between competing knights sometimes flowed toward the tournament's organizer as well, meaning a well-run event could turn a real profit for the host lord, even before accounting for the softer benefits of prestige and political goodwill gained by successfully staging a spectacle grand enough to draw nobility from across the region. This economic dimension helps explain why, despite the church's repeated attempts to discourage or ban tournaments outright, condemning them at various points as wasteful, dangerous, and a distraction from more appropriate Christian pursuits like crusading, the events persisted and even expanded across the high and late medieval periods. Too many people, from the knights competing for glory and ransom money to the towns and merchants profiting from their presence, had a genuine stake in tournaments continuing, and that economic reality repeatedly outlasted official religious disapproval. Knights spent far more of their military careers around castles than in the open, sweeping cavalry charges most associated with the era. Early medieval castles typically followed a motte and bailey design, a wooden or stone keep raised on an artificial earthen mound. The motte alongside an enclosed courtyard. The bailey, a design that could be constructed relatively quickly and cheaply while still offering real defensive advantage. Over the following centuries, castle design grew steadily more sophisticated, moving toward concentric fortifications with multiple rings of walls, each one a fresh obstacle for an attacker who had already fought through the last, along with deep ditches or water-filled moats, thick curtain walls studded with towers, and gatehouses defended by portcullises, murder holes for dropping projectiles on attackers below, and narrow arrow slits, allowing defenders to shoot with minimal exposure to return fire. Siege warfare demanded patience as often as violence. Starving a garrison into surrender through blockade frequently proved more effective and far less costly in lives than a direct assault against well-built walls. And sieges could stretch on for months or even years as attackers waited out a castle's food and water supplies. When a more active approach was needed, besiegers turned to a range of specialized siege engines. The trebuchet, a counterweight-powered device capable of hurling large stones or other projectiles with real accuracy over long distances. The battering ram for breaking down gates and weaker sections of wall. And siege towers, tall wooden structures rolled up against a castle's walls to allow attackers to climb over at height rather than fight through a heavily defended gate at ground level. Knights served in siege warfare in varied roles, sometimes leading assaults on breaches in a wall, sometimes commanding garrisons defending their own castles against attack, and sometimes simply providing the mounted force needed to intercept relief columns attempting to break a siege from outside. The romantic image of knightly warfare as a series of open battles and personal duels obscures how much of actual medieval military life revolved instead around these slower, grinding contests over fortified positions, where engineering, supply, and patience often mattered as much as individual combat skill. Individual siege engines could become famous enough in their own time to be given proper names, much like the legendary swords carried by individual knights. Warwolf, a massive trebuchet built on the orders of King Edward I of England for the 1304 siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland, was reportedly so enormous and so feared that the castle's garrison attempted to surrender before it was even finished being assembled. An offer Edward supposedly refused specifically so he could see his new weapon in action regardless, according to accounts from the period. Whether every detail survives with full accuracy after more than 7 centuries of retelling, the story captures something real about how a single piece of equipment, like a sword or a warhorse, could take on an almost personal, storied reputation among the armies that built and feared it. Heraldry developed from a practical problem. Once knights began covering their faces with enclosed helms for better protection, recognizing friend from foe on a chaotic battlefield became a real problem. The solution was a system of distinctive, hereditary symbols and colors. A coat of arms displayed on a knight's shield, surcoat, and banner, allowing him to be identified at a distance even with his face completely hidden. The specialized language of heraldry grew into its own detailed system, governed by strict conventions. A shield's background color, called the field, and the symbols placed upon it followed a defined set of tinctures, including the metals gold and silver, and colors such as red, blue, black, green, and purple, combined according to rules meant to keep designs visually distinct and legible even at a distance. Common charges, the symbols placed on a shield, ranged from simple geometric shapes called ordinaries, such as a cross or a diagonal band, to a wide menagerie of animals, real and imagined, each carrying its own associations: lions for courage, eagles for nobility and far-sightedness, and stranger creatures like griffins or wyverns representing a blend of qualities drawn from the animals they combined. Officials called heralds specialized in this system, tasked with identifying combatants at tournaments and battles, announcing challenges, and maintaining detailed records of who held the right to bear which arms, since a coat of arms functioned as a form of hereditary property, passed down through families and occasionally granted fresh by a monarch as a mark of honor. Heralds developed their own formal, almost legalistic language for describing a coat of arms precisely enough that it could be reconstructed from the description alone, a practice called blazon, still used by heraldic authorities in parts of the world today. Families that married into other noble lines, or that inherited claims from multiple sources, sometimes combined several coats of arms onto a single shield through a technique called quartering, producing increasingly elaborate designs across generations that could, for the most illustrious families, visually summarize an entire genealogy at a glance. Heralds carried an additional and truly important function during actual wartime as well, serving as protected messengers between opposing forces. A herald crossing into enemy territory to deliver a formal message, announce terms, or negotiate a truce operated under a widely recognized convention of safe passage, a kind of early diplomatic immunity that, while not always honored perfectly in practice, held up well enough across the medieval period to make heralds highly useful as a reliable channel of communication, even between armies actively at war with one another. This role placed heralds in an unusual position within medieval society, trusted enough to move freely between hostile camps and knowledgeable enough about heraldic identification to confirm exactly which lords and commanders they were dealing with on either side. A specialized expertise that made them indispensable to the practical conduct of medieval warfare in ways that went well beyond their more familiar role, announcing jousts and recording tournament results. Not every knight served a single lord or kingdom. Beginning in the early 12th century, a new kind of institution emerged, combining the martial life of a knight with the religious devotion of a monk, the military religious order. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem following the First Crusade, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience just as any monk would, while also training and fighting as heavily armed cavalry, recognizable by their white mantles marked with a red cross. The Templars grew into something far beyond a fighting force. Because pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land faced real danger carrying cash across such distances, the order developed an early banking system, allowing a traveler to deposit funds with the Templars in Europe and withdraw an equivalent sum using a form of letter of credit once they reached the Holy Land. A genuine innovation in medieval finance, built on a network of Templar houses stretching across the continent. This financial power, combined with the order's independence and the substantial debts owed to it by kings and nobles, eventually made the Templars a target. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, moved to have its members arrested on charges of heresy, and the order was formally dissolved a few years later, its last Grand Master executed in 1314. A popular modern association links the original arrests, which took place on Friday the 13th of October, to the enduring superstition around that date. Though most historians treat this connection as a later invention, rather than something medieval people themselves actually believed. The Knights Hospitaller, founded slightly earlier to run a hospital caring for sick and injured pilgrims in Jerusalem, developed along a similar path toward military service, eventually becoming one of the most enduring of all the crusading orders. Surviving the fall of the Crusader states and relocating first to Rhodes and later to Malta, where a version of the order continues in a charitable, non-military form today. The Teutonic Knights, founded slightly later still and drawing heavily from German-speaking nobility, initially served a similar hospital and protective role before shifting their focus northward. Spending much of the 13th and 14th centuries campaigning in the Baltic region against pagan peoples in what became known as the Northern Crusades, eventually carving out their own substantial territorial state along the Baltic coast. Each order combined the discipline and structure of monastic life with the combat readiness of professional knighthood, producing some of the most consistently effective and well-organized fighting forces of the medieval period, bound by vows that set them apart from the more individually motivated knights serving secular lords across the rest of Europe. The Crusades, a series of religious military campaigns launched by Western European Christians beginning in 1095, drew heavily on the knightly class both as fighters and as leaders, and the experience of campaigning across the Mediterranean and the Holy Land shaped medieval knighthood in lasting ways. Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont promised spiritual rewards, including forgiveness of sins, to those who took up arms to reclaim Jerusalem, an offer that resonated strongly with a warrior class already inclined to seek both glory and religious merit through combat. Richard I of England, remembered to history as Richard the Lionheart, became one of the most celebrated knightly figures of the Third Crusade, admired even by his opponents for his tactical skill and personal courage in battle. His principal adversary, Saladin, the Kurdish and Muslim sultan who had reclaimed Jerusalem from Christian control, earned a similar reputation among European chroniclers for chivalry and fair dealing, and the two leaders, despite fighting on opposing sides of a long and often brutal conflict, were said to have exchanged gifts and shown genuine mutual respect. A relationship later medieval and modern storytellers have returned to repeatedly as an example of chivalric ideals crossing religious and cultural lines even amid war. The Crusades also connected directly back to these same military religious orders, since the Templars and Hospitallers both grew directly out of the need to protect and support the flow of pilgrims and soldiers moving between Europe and the Crusader states established in the Holy Land. These campaigns brought European knights into sustained contact with Byzantine and Islamic scholarship in areas like medicine, mathematics, and certain military technologies. One strand, alongside the destruction and violence the Crusades undeniably caused. In a much wider transmission of knowledge into Latin Europe that also ran through Iberia, Sicily, and ordinary trade and scholarly contact rather than through crusading alone. Spanish and Portuguese military religious orders, including the Order of Santiago and the Order of Calatrava, developed alongside the Reconquista's ongoing frontier conflict, blending crusading religious purpose with the practical demands of holding and expanding contested territory. Late medieval Europe continued producing new chivalric orders, even as knighthood's practical battlefield role was beginning its long decline. The Order of the Golden Fleece, founded in 1430 by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, brought together the highest nobility of one of the wealthiest and most culturally significant courts in 15th century Europe. Its elaborate rituals and restricted membership reflecting chivalry's ongoing transformation into a marker of elite social and political status, even as gunpowder and changing tactics steadily eroded the older, more purely martial foundations the whole institution had originally rested on. William Marshall, whose tournament career had already made him famous, did not remain merely a professional competitor. He went on to serve 5 English kings across his lifetime and ultimately act as regent for the boy king Henry III, helping steer England through a genuine succession crisis before his own death in 1219. A detailed biographical poem written shortly after his death, commissioned by his own son, survives today as one of the fullest accounts of any medieval knight's life, offering historians an unusually direct window into the practical realities of a career built on martial skill, loyalty, and political judgment in roughly equal measure. El Cid, born Rodrigo Díaz de Bivar in 11th century Castile, became medieval Spain's most celebrated warrior, fighting at various points for both Christian and Muslim rulers during the complex, shifting political landscape of the Iberian Peninsula before eventually carving out his own independent rule over the city of Valencia. His later legend, recorded in the epic poem El Cantar de Mio Cid, blended real historical achievement with considerable embellishment, turning a skilled and pragmatic mercenary commander into a national symbol of Christian Spanish identity centuries after his actual death. Bertrand de Guesclin, a French knight of the 14th century, rose from relatively humble noble origins to become Constable of France. The kingdom's senior military commander, praised for tactics that favored careful strategy, sieges, and the avoidance of unnecessary open battles over the more glamorous cavalry charges celebrated in chivalric literature. An approach that proved highly effective against English forces during the 100 Years' War, even as it departed from the more romantic image of knighthood many of his contemporaries still idealized. Trial by combat, a formal legal proceeding in which 2 parties settled a dispute through single combat under the belief that God would grant victory to whichever side had truth on their side, offers one of the more striking intersections between knighthood and medieval law. One of the last officially sanctioned judicial duels in France took place in 1386, when the knight Jean de Carouge fought Jacques Le Gris over an accusation Carouges had brought against him, a case that drew enormous public attention at the time and has since become the basis for several modern retellings. Edward of Woodstock, better known to history as the Black Prince, stands among the most celebrated English knights of the 14th century, earning his reputation through decisive victories at Crécy, where he commanded a division of the English army while still in his teens, and at Poitiers a decade later, where his forces captured the French King John II, one of the most dramatic single feats of the entire war. The nickname Black Prince did not appear in any source during his own lifetime, and historians remain uncertain of its exact origin, with theories ranging from the color of armor he supposedly favored to a later, retrospective association with the harshness of some of his military campaigns in France. Alongside these historical figures stood King Arthur, whose legend, drawn together from Welsh and Breton folklore, French romance, and English chronicle writing over several centuries, shaped medieval understanding of ideal knighthood as thoroughly as any real historical figure did. Whether a historical individual resembling Arthur actually existed remains truly unresolved among historians, with evidence too thin and too late to settle the question either way. But the Arthurian legend of the Round Table, the quest for the Holy Grail, and knights like Lancelot and Gawain provided medieval audiences with a shared cultural language for discussing chivalric virtue, loyalty, and betrayal that real historical knights actively measured themselves against, regardless of whether the king who supposedly inspired it all had ever truly lived. Long before Chrétien de Troyes and the courtly romance tradition that would come to dominate later medieval literature, an earlier form of heroic poetry called the chanson de geste, or song of deeds, celebrated knighthood in a rougher, more martial register. The Song of Roland, generally considered the oldest surviving major work in this tradition, and likely composed in something close to its familiar form by the late 11th century, recounts a heavily embellished version of a real historical event, the destruction of Charlemagne's rearguard by Basque forces at Roncesvalles Pass in 778, transformed in the poem into an epic last stand against overwhelming Muslim armies, reflecting the poem's own later composition during an age increasingly shaped by crusading ideology rather than the actual circumstances of the historical ambush it was loosely based on. The poem's hero, Roland, carries an enchanted horn called an oliphant, and the epic's most famous and most debated moment involves his prideful refusal to sound it and call for reinforcements until the battle has already turned hopeless, a decision that costs his own life and the lives of his companions, but that the poem frames as a complicated blend of tragic flaw and genuine heroic honor rather than simple foolishness. This earlier poetic tradition, valuing loyalty, martial prowess, and stoic endurance above the more romantic themes of courtly love that would come to dominate later medieval literature, shows how much chivalric ideals shifted across the medieval centuries rather than holding to one single, unchanging form from beginning to end. Medieval knighthood and medieval literature shaped each other continuously, each feeding the other's development across several centuries. Chrétien de Troyes, a French poet writing in the 12th century, produced some of the earliest and most influential Arthurian romances, introducing or popularizing figures like Lancelot and developing the literary conventions of courtly love and knightly quest that would echo through European storytelling for generations afterward. His work helped establish the romance as a distinct literary genre, one built around a knight's individual adventures, tests of character, and pursuit of both honor and love, rather than the larger-scale historical or heroic narratives that had dominated earlier medieval storytelling. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in England toward the end of the 14th century, offered a rather different portrait of knighthood in his Canterbury Tales. His knight, described among the pilgrims traveling together in the poem's frame narrative, is presented as a truly admirable figure, a veteran of real campaigns across multiple crusading fronts, modest in dress despite his considerable experience, and devoted to truth, honor, and courtesy in a way that reads as sincere rather than merely decorative, offering modern readers one of the clearest surviving statements of what 14th century English culture considered an ideal knight actually to be. Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, compiled in the 15th century and drawing together French and English Arthurian material into a single sprawling English prose narrative, became the most influential single retelling of the Arthurian legend for centuries afterward, shaping how later English-speaking audiences would picture Camelot, the Round Table, and the eventual tragic collapse of Arthur's kingdom through the betrayals and divided loyalties among his own knights. Malory himself makes for an unusual author of a work celebrating chivalric virtue, since surviving records indicate he was imprisoned multiple times on charges including theft and violence, which has led historians to debate exactly how sincerely or how wistfully he intended his own idealized portrait of knighthood to be read. These literary traditions did more than entertain. Real knights across medieval Europe absorbed Romance literature as a genuine guide to behavior, modeling their own conduct, their tournament performances, and even the language of their private correspondence on the ideals these stories celebrated, creating a continuous feedback loop between the knighthood people actually lived and the knighthood storytellers imagined, each shaping the other in ways that make it difficult, even for historians today, to fully separate the historical institution from the literary ideal that grew up alongside it. Away from battle and tournament, a knight's daily existence revolved heavily around the management of his estate and the obligations attached to his land. A typical knight's fee required roughly 40 days of military service each year to the lord who had granted the land, though this figure varied across regions and centuries, and much of a knight's remaining time was spent overseeing agricultural production, settling local disputes, and maintaining the household that supported his family, servants, and any squires training under him. The feudal system that originally bound a knight's land to his military obligation gradually gave way, across the later medieval centuries, to arrangements built increasingly around money rather than personal service. Scutage, meaning shield money, allowed a knight or landholder to pay a fee to his lord instead of physically showing up for the required period of military service, a practice that began as an occasional convenience and grew by the 13th century in England into a routine and significant source of royal revenue. Kings found this arrangement highly useful, since cash payments could be used to hire professional soldiers who might serve for as long as a campaign actually required, rather than the limited 40 days a feudal knight traditionally owed, offering far more flexibility for extended wars fought far from home. This shift helped fuel the rise of what historians sometimes call bastard feudalism, a later medieval system in which lords increasingly relied on paid retainers bound by contract rather than traditional land-based feudal obligation, offering wages and maintenance in exchange for military service defined by written agreement rather than inherited custom. Retained knights under this system might serve a lord for years, at a stretch in exchange for steady payment, a livery uniform marking their allegiance, and a share of any spoils or ransoms, an arrangement that functioned in practice much like a professional employment contract, despite still being wrapped in the older language and symbolism of chivalric loyalty. By the close of the medieval period, the economic foundation of knighthood had shifted so thoroughly toward money that the older image of a knight fighting purely out of inherited land-based obligation to his lord had become, for most practical purposes, an idealized memory rather than the operating reality of how armies were actually raised and paid. Literacy among knights varied a great deal across the medieval period, and by individual circumstance. Earlier medieval knights often relied on clergy or trained clerks to handle reading and writing, focusing their own education on horsemanship, combat, and the social skills expected of the aristocracy. Though literacy among the knightly class grew steadily more common as the medieval period progressed, above all as vernacular literature. Romances and devotional texts written in everyday spoken languages rather than Latin became more widely available and fashionable among noble households. A knight's relationship with the peasants working his land was defined largely by the feudal obligations running in both directions. Peasants owed labor, a portion of their harvest, and various fees to their lord, while the lord, at least in principle, owed protection and a degree of basic justice in return. This arrangement varied enormously depending on the individual lord's temperament and the specific customs of a given region. And while some medieval writing does describe relationships that read as sincerely caring on the lord's part, the system as a whole rested on a stark inequality of power that gave peasants little real recourse against an unjust or exploitative lord. Women occupied a more complicated place within the world of chivalry than the literature of courtly love, with its idealized passive ladies waiting in towers, tends to suggest. A noblewoman whose husband was away at war or on crusade frequently took direct charge of running the estate in his absence, overseeing tenants, managing finances, and in some documented cases, personally directing the defense of a castle under siege. Since responsibility for a household's security did not simply pause because its lord happened to be elsewhere. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the entire medieval period, ruled her own substantial territories in her own right, married first the King of France and later the King of England, and even accompanied crusading forces to the Holy Land during her first marriage. An unusually direct level of involvement in the wider world of knightly warfare and politics for a woman of any era in medieval Europe. Women could also, under certain feudal systems, inherit land and the military obligations attached to it, meaning a woman might technically hold a knight's fee and owe the service connected to it, typically fulfilled in practice by hiring or appointing a knight to serve in her place rather than fighting personally. A small number of religious military orders did include female members known as consoeurs or dames, women who took vows alongside male knights and supported the order's charitable and administrative work. Though they were rarely, if ever, expected to fight directly in the way their male counterparts did. The most famous exception to this general pattern arrived toward the very end of the medieval period: Joan of Arc, a French peasant girl who claimed divine guidance and led French troops to several significant victories during the 100 Years' War in the early 15th century. Joan was never formally knighted and operated outside the conventional structures of chivalric training altogether. Yet she wore armor, rode at the head of armies, and was treated by supporters and enemies alike as a genuine military commander, a role no formal system of the period had ever quite anticipated. A woman filling, and one that ultimately contributed to the accusations that led to her trial and execution by an English-aligned church court in 1431. Life at a medieval lord's court offered a night rest and celebration between the more demanding stretches of campaign and training, and the great hall feast stood at the center of that social world. A wealthy lord's table might feature roasted meats, game birds caught through falconry, richly spiced dishes reflecting the considerable expense and prestige of imported spices, and elaborate sugar or pastry sculptures called subtleties, presented between courses more as entertainment and display than as food meant for eating. Wine and ale flowed freely at these gatherings, and a feast could stretch across many hours, filled with music, dancing, and performances by minstrels and jesters whose job combined genuine entertainment with, often, a surprising amount of pointed social commentary delivered under the protective cover of humor. Music and storytelling filled the space between meals, with traveling minstrels and resident court musicians performing songs that ranged from simple entertainment to the more formal chansons de geste, heroic narrative poems celebrating legendary deeds, and the softer courtly love songs so closely tied to chivalric romance. Board games and gambling with dice were common pastimes as well, and chess held particular prestige among the nobility, considered a valuable exercise in strategic thinking, suitable for a class of men expected to plan military campaigns as readily as they fought in them. Banners, standards, and battle cries served a more urgent purpose than any feast, providing the basic tools of command and coordination on a chaotic medieval battlefield where written orders were useless, and a commander's voice could carry only so far over the noise of combat. Each lord's personal banner, marked with his heraldic device, served as a rallying point, and knights were trained to keep track of their own banner's position at all times, since becoming separated from it in the confusion of battle could mean becoming isolated among enemies with no clear way back to friendly lines. Trumpets and drums carried simple, prearranged signals across distances. A shouted voice never could, directing advances, retreats, or changes in formation, while battle cries, often a lord's name, a religious invocation, or a phrase tied to a particular region or cause, served both to intimidate an approaching enemy and to help scattered soldiers locate and rally around their own side amid the noise and confusion of close combat. A knight's identity did not end with his death, and medieval funerary custom developed its own set of practices, specifically marking the passing of an armored warrior. Effigies, the carved stone or metal figures placed atop the graves of wealthy knights and nobles, were carved with real care to reflect a knight's actual armor and heraldic identity, and many surviving examples depict the deceased with legs crossed at the ankle. A pose some earlier antiquarians mistakenly believed indicated crusading service, though modern scholarship generally treats this as simply a stylistic convention of the period rather than any reliable marker of a knight's specific military history. A knight's sword frequently accompanied him in death in some symbolic form, whether an actual weapon buried alongside the body in earlier medieval centuries or, in later periods when burial customs shifted toward church interment, carved directly into the stone or brass of the memorial itself. The blade laid across the effigy's chest or resting along its side as a permanent marker of the profession that had defined its owner's life. Heraldic banners and shields belonging to the deceased were sometimes hung above a tomb or within the family's parish church, a lasting, visible reminder of lineage and service that later descendants could point to for generations, reinforcing the same connection between family identity and coat of arms that ran through the whole heraldic system. Funeral rites for a knight of sufficient rank could become substantial public events in their own right, involving processions, requiem masses, and the formal presentation of the deceased's arms and armor, sometimes carried by mourners dressed to represent the knight's household or lineage. a ceremony meant to honor the individual, while simultaneously reaffirming the continuity of his family's status and obligations to the next generation, who would inherit both his land and the responsibilities attached to it. The 100 Years' War, stretching intermittently from 1337 to 1453 between England and France, offers one of the richest sources of knightly detail from the later medieval period, precisely because it unfolded during the era when knighthood, armor, and battlefield tactics were all changing at once. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356 saw an English force, though badly outnumbered, defeat and capture the French King John II himself, whose ransom, negotiated over several years, placed a truly enormous financial strain on the French crown and its already war-weakened economy. Ransom culture more broadly shaped how the war was fought at the level of individual knights, since capturing a wealthy or high-ranking opponent alive could make a soldier's fortune, creating an incentive structure that sometimes ran directly against a commander's preference for a decisive, complete victory. The war also produced moments where the newer, less romantic tools of medieval warfare proved just how thoroughly they could overturn traditional knightly advantages. At Agincourt in 1415, English forces under Henry V, exhausted, outnumbered, and fighting on ground, turned to deep mud by recent rain, still inflicted catastrophic losses on the advancing French knights, whose heavy armor became a genuine liability once they were forced to struggle on foot through the churned, waterlogged field under a sustained barrage of longbow fire, with many reportedly exhausted or trampled before ever reaching the English line. Modern historians continue to debate the precise casualty figures reported by medieval chroniclers, which vary a great deal and were likely exaggerated in places for political or propaganda purposes. But even conservative estimates describe French losses that dwarfed those suffered by the English, a lopsided outcome that reshaped how European commanders thought about the balance between armored cavalry and disciplined missile infantry for the rest of the medieval period. Not every notable engagement of the era pitted English longbowmen against French knights. The Battle of Castillon in 1453, generally treated as the war's final major engagement, is often cited as an early landmark in the growing role of artillery, since French cannon played a decisive part in breaking an English assault. A conflict that had begun with knights as the unquestioned masters of the battlefield, now ending with gunpowder, increasingly setting the terms of how wars would be fought. Medieval battlefield medicine operated with far less understanding of infection and anatomy than modern practice, though it was neither as primitive nor as helpless as popular imagination sometimes assumes. Battlefield surgeons, often trained through a mix of apprenticeship, barber-surgeon guild practice, and knowledge passed down from earlier medical writers, treated wounds with techniques ranging from truly useful, such as cleaning injuries and setting broken bones, to remedies modern medicine would consider ineffective or even harmful, including certain herbal poultices and the practice of cauterizing wounds with heated metal to stop bleeding, a method that could save a life through blood loss control, even as it caused additional trauma and pain in the process. Arrow wounds presented their own particular difficulty, since removing an arrowhead cleanly, especially one with barbed edges designed to resist easy extraction, required specialized tools and no small amount of skill, and a poorly handled removal could cause more damage than the original wound. Wealthy knights captured on the battlefield sometimes received better medical care than the average soldier, both out of real concern and out of the very practical calculation that a captive worth a substantial ransom needed to survive long enough for that ransom to actually be paid. A grim but effective incentive that occasionally worked in an injured prisoner's favor. Death in battle came in forms far less cinematic than popular depictions often suggest, and blunt force trauma from maces, hammers, and the sheer weight of falling from a horse in full armor accounted for a significant share of knightly casualties, alongside the more familiar image of sword and lance wounds. Heat exhaustion and dehydration posed a real danger as well, above all during long engagements fought in full armor under a hot sun. A risk modern historians have increasingly recognized as a genuine contributing factor in several major medieval battles where exhausted. Overheated knights struggled to fight effectively even before taking a single wound. European knightly tactics, built around the shock power of an armored cavalry charge, did not always transfer smoothly to conflicts fought against very different styles of warfare. And some of the more instructive encounters in this respect came against the Mongol armies that pushed into Eastern Europe during the 13th century. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, a combined force of Polish, German, and Allied knights met a Mongol army whose entire approach to warfare relied on mobility, coordinated horse archery, and disciplined feigned retreats designed to draw an enemy out of formation. Tactics that European heavy cavalry, built around a single decisive charge, struggled to counter effectively. The battle ended in a serious defeat for the European forces, offering a clear demonstration that knightly warfare, however dominant within its familiar European context, was not automatically superior against every style of opponent a knight might realistically face. Knights fighting in the Baltic campaigns of the Teutonic Order encountered their own set of unfamiliar challenges. Fighting against Lithuanian and other Baltic forces skilled in forest and winter warfare, terrain, and conditions that limited the advantages heavy cavalry normally enjoyed on open ground. Similarly, knights campaigning in the Holy Land during the Crusades had to adapt to opponents like the Ayyubid and later Mamluk forces, whose own cavalry, including skilled horse archers, and whose familiarity with the region's climate and terrain, forced European commanders to develop tactics quite different from those that worked reliably on the plains of France or England. These encounters offer a useful corrective to any picture of the medieval knight as an unstoppable, universally dominant military figure. Knighthood's real strengths, discipline, individual combat skill, and the genuine shock value of a coordinated heavy cavalry charge against the right kind of opponent could be neutralized or turned into a liability by an enemy with a fundamentally different approach to mobility, terrain, or combined arms coordination. Several persistent ideas about medieval knights and their world turn out to be far shakier than popular culture suggests, and the chastity belt offers one of the clearest examples. The chastity belt, a supposed metal device locking away a woman's virtue while her husband traveled abroad, occupies a shaky place in the historical record. Despite its enduring presence in popular imagination, surviving physical examples generally date from centuries after the medieval period, many apparently manufactured during the Renaissance or even later as curiosities or jokes rather than genuine medieval security devices. And historians today largely regard the chastity belt as a myth with only the thinnest medieval basis, if any at all. The idea that medieval Europeans, knights included, rarely bathed and lived in near constant filth also oversimplifies a more complicated picture. Public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns and cities, and personal cleanliness was valued in various periods and regions, though attitudes did shift over time, above all following the arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. When some physicians began advising against bathing out of a mistaken belief that opening the body's pores through hot water left a person more vulnerable to disease. Popular imagination also tends to picture medieval Europe as locked in continuous, chaotic warfare. Yet many knights spent long stretches of their lives in relative peace, managing estates, attending court, hunting, and only occasionally called to actual military campaigns that might last weeks or months rather than years without pause. And the image of medieval battles as simple, straightforward clashes of armored men swinging swords underestimates just how much tactical thinking, terrain use, and combined arms coordination between cavalry, infantry, and archers actually shaped the outcomes of major medieval engagements. A level of complexity historians have increasingly emphasized as archaeological and documentary research has deepened over recent decades. Knighthood never developed as a single, uniform institution across medieval Europe, and real regional differences shaped how the role functioned from one kingdom to the next. English knighthood developed within a relatively centralized feudal structure following the Norman conquest, with land tenure and military obligation organized fairly systematically under royal authority, while French knighthood spread across a kingdom that remained politically fragmented for much longer, saw greater regional variation, with powerful dukes and counts often commanding loyalty that rivaled or exceeded that owed to the French crown itself. German-speaking territories developed their own distinctive category of knight, the ministeriales, a class that began as unfree servants of a lord, technically closer to serfs than nobles in legal status, but who gradually rose through military service to occupy positions of real influence and, eventually, something close to full noble status. An unusual path to knighthood that had no direct equivalent in England or France, where knighthood remained more consistently tied to free landholding status from an earlier stage. The Iberian Peninsula, divided for centuries between Christian and Muslim kingdoms during the long period of conflict and shifting alliances known as the Reconquista, produced knights whose loyalties could shift with the political landscape itself, serving Christian rulers at one point in a career and Muslim ones at another as circumstances and alliances demanded. Italy, fragmented into numerous independent city-states rather than unified under a single feudal monarchy, developed a distinctive military culture centered less on traditional knightly obligation and more on the condottieri, professional mercenary captains who led hired companies of soldiers, including armored cavalry, contracted by whichever city or ruler paid best at a given moment. This more transactional, contract-based approach to armed service, while sharing real similarities with knighthood elsewhere in terms of equipment and battlefield role, reflected Italy's particular political fragmentation and its cities' greater reliance on wealth and commerce rather than traditional landholding as the basis of military power. The dominance of the mounted armored knight did not end suddenly, but eroded gradually across the 14th and 15th centuries, worn down by a combination of new weapons and new tactics that steadily reduced cavalry's advantage on the battlefield. The English longbow, capable of shooting armor-piercing arrows at a rapid rate in the hands of a trained archer, played a decisive role in several major English victories over French knights during the 100 Years' War, most famously at Crecy in 1346 and, decades later, at Agincourt. Infantry tactics evolved as well. Disciplined formations of pikemen, especially the Swiss pike squares that gained a fearsome reputation across late medieval Europe, could present an advancing knight with a dense wall of leveled spear points, capable of stopping a cavalry charge. Cold, forcing armies to increasingly rely on well-drilled infantry alongside. Or sometimes, instead of mounted knights, gunpowder weapons delivered the more lasting blow. Early handheld firearms and, more significantly, cannon capable of battering down castle walls that had withstood siege engines centuries, gradually transformed both open battle and siege warfare across the 15th and 16th centuries. Armour continued to improve for a time in response, growing thicker and more carefully shaped to deflect projectiles. But the basic economics of warfare had begun shifting decisively away from a small, expensively equipped elite of mounted specialists and toward larger standing armies built around disciplined infantry, artillery, and eventually firearms accessible to ordinary soldiers with comparatively little specialized training. Knighthood itself did not disappear so much as change function. By the 16th and 17th centuries, being knighted increasingly signified social status and royal favor rather than an active military role, a shift that continued steadily until knighthood, in the parts of the world where it survives today, exists almost entirely as an honor recognizing achievement or service, disconnected from the armored cavalry that had defined it for the better part of 5 centuries. Knighthood's afterlife in modern culture stretches from the deeply serious to the almost accidental. The knight remains one of the 6 standard pieces on a chessboard, its distinctive L-shaped movement, jumping over other pieces entirely, unlike anything else on the board. Popular explanation often reads this as a stylized nod to a mounted warrior's mobility, though the piece's move predates any settled written rationale for it, and chess historians are generally cautious about attaching a firm, documented origin story to a rule that likely just evolved through play across many centuries and several cultures before the game reached its familiar modern form. Modern honors systems, above all in the United Kingdom, preserve knighthood as a living title, even though its connection to actual combat vanished centuries ago. The Order of the Garter, founded by King Edward III around 1348, ranks as one of the oldest orders of chivalry still in active use today. Its membership limited to a small number of individuals personally selected by the reigning monarch as a mark of exceptional service or distinction. Modern knighthoods, granting recipients the title Sir or Dame, continue to be awarded regularly in Britain to figures from fields as varied as science, entertainment, business, and public service. A use of medieval terminology so far removed from its original martial context that a knighted actor or musician shares a title with men who once charged into battle on armored horses, connected across the centuries by nothing more than a word and a ceremonial tap of a sword. The 19th century saw a genuine wave of romantic interest in reviving medieval chivalry, fueled heavily by the enormous popularity of novelist Sir Walter Scott, whose historical fiction helped shape an idealized, adventurous image of knighthood for Victorian audiences already nostalgic for a past that had, by that point, been gone for centuries. This enthusiasm reached a memorable, if somewhat disastrous, peak in 1839 with the Eglinton tournament, an elaborate attempt by a wealthy Scottish earl to stage a full medieval-style jousting tournament, complete with costume knights and thousands of spectators. An ambitious revival undone almost entirely by torrential rain that turned the event into a muddy, chaotic disappointment, widely mocked in the press at the time. Though it remains a genuine, well-documented curiosity in the long history of how later centuries have kept returning to and reimagining the Age of Knights. Much of what is known today about medieval knighthood comes not from grand chronicles alone, but from careful archaeological work, a source of evidence that has repeatedly corrected or refined the picture handed down through literary and artistic tradition. One of the richest single discoveries came from the island of Gotland, off the coast of Sweden, where mass graves connected to the Battle of Visby in 1361 were excavated in the 20th century, preserving the remains of hundreds of fighters, many still wearing pieces of their armor when they were buried, apparently in haste, shortly after the battle itself. The Visby graves offered researchers an unusually direct record of the wounds medieval combatants actually suffered, and the classic study of the site found leg wounds unusually common among the dead, consistent with fighters, many of them poorly equipped local defenders rather than fully armored knights, whose lower bodies had far less protection than their heads and torsos, a level of physical detail written sources alone rarely provide. Sculptors carving tomb effigies often worked from direct observation or first-hand knowledge, rendering a knight's armor, weapons, and heraldic devices with real precision and giving historians a dated, geographically specific snapshot of exactly what equipment looked like at a particular moment in a particular region. Evidence that has helped correct assumptions drawn purely from later artistic reconstructions or romanticized illustrations produced centuries after the fact. Museum collections around the world, including major holdings at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, the Wallace Collection in London, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, preserve surviving suits of armor and weapons that allow modern researchers and modern reenactors to test popular assumptions directly against physical reality, weighing original pieces, testing their range of motion, and in some cases, commissioning careful reproductions to study how these objects actually performed in the hands of a trained user rather than relying solely on written description or artistic depiction. This combination of documentary, artistic, and physical archaeological evidence, brought together over the past century of dedicated scholarship, has done more than perhaps any single medieval chronicle to separate the real, practical world of medieval knighthood from the layers of romantic embellishment later centuries have added on top of it. There is a particular kind of stillness worth returning to now after everything else, the Vigil of Arms, already introduced earlier as part of the dubbing ceremony, when a young man about to become a knight spent the night before his knighting alone inside a chapel, his sword and armor resting on the altar in front of him, keeping watch through the dark hours in prayer and quiet reflection rather than sleep. It was, in its own way, the last night of one identity before the first morning of another. And medieval writers describing the practice returned again and again to its silence. No feast, no music, no companions, just a young man, a handful of candles, and the steady, patient presence of the weapons he was about to be entrusted with. Everything gathered across this account. The stirrup that made mounted warfare possible in the first place. The slow climb from page to squire to knight. The mail and plate armor built to turn aside a blade. the swords carrying names of their own, the destriers bred and trained for the shock of a charge, the Templars and Hospitallers binding monastic vows to martial service, the tournaments where a landless younger son like William Marshall could win a fortune through skill alone, the castles built ring within ring against a patient siege, the coats of arms that let a man be recognized even with his face hidden entirely, the Crusades that carried European knights across the Mediterranean and brought foreign learning back the other way, the decline that gunpowder and disciplined infantry eventually brought to a style of warfare that had dominated Europe for the better part of 5 centuries. All of it eventually arrives back at this same quiet room. Because knighthood, for everything it became, always began here, with one person alone keeping watch. The vigil asked something specific of the young man undertaking it, to sit with the weight of what he was about to become before he was permitted to act on it at all. Chroniclers of the period described candidates using these hours to examine their own conscience, to pray for the strength to live up to the ideals chivalry claimed to represent, even as the historical record makes clear how unevenly those ideals were actually honored, and simply to rest in the particular silence available only in the hours before dawn, when a hall or a household or an entire castle has finally gone quiet around a single burning light. By morning, after mass and confession, the young man who had kept his vigil would rise, be struck lightly on the shoulder with the flat of a blade, and stand as a knight, his sword no longer resting untouched on an altar, but belted at his own side, ready for whatever the daylight world required of him. But the story can end for tonight before that moment arrives. Let the candles stay lit a little longer. Let the sword rest exactly where it has been placed, undisturbed, catching only a thin, steady line of candlelight along its edge. Let the vigil continue exactly as it was meant to, not as a test to be passed or a duty to be finished, but simply as what it always was underneath the ceremony. One quiet room, one small light, and the unhurried, settled stillness of someone finally allowed to stop moving, to stop striving, and simply keep watch until morning comes on its own.